It's November 11th, 1918. The Great War is just minutes away from ending. The ceasefire set to take effect at 11 a.m. Soldiers on both sides are weary, ready to lay down their arms after 4 years of unimaginable horror. But in these final moments, history takes one last tragic turn. Henry Gunther, an American soldier, becomes the last casualty of World War I. How and why did this happen? Was it bravery, a misunderstanding, or something more? Today we dive into the life and death of Henry Gunther, the man whose story became an unforgettable symbol of the war's senseless end. Let's begin. World War I was one of the most painful events in world history. More than 60 million soldiers were involved in this war, which spanned thousands of kilometers. The war had an impact on many different places, from the Balkans to the Far East, from Western Europe to Arabia. By the end of 1914, when the war began, almost half of the world's population was living in the countries that took part. The war was also a struggle with thousands of painful stories. Millions of men went to the front to protect their homeland for 4 years, leaving their parents, wives, and children behind. Defending the homeland also meant shooting a father, a wife, or a young boy. Hundreds of thousands of people would share this fate. The Western Front was undoubtedly the most bitter part of the war. The Germans gathered their troops on the French border and invaded Belgium. Britain didn't want to leave its ally France to fend for itself, so it moved its troops to continental Europe. The French territories that the Germans began to occupy in the hope of a quick victory would become the graveyard for millions of people. As per the strategy Alfred von Schlieffen had devised years earlier, Paris would fall and France would be out of the war. The French were also preparing to take back Alsace-Lorraine, which they had been after since their defeat in 1871. The French army used the concepts of élan and crâne to counter the powerful weapons that the developing German industry had gifted to the army. Élan, which means to rush forward and attack, was an important part of the French army's strategy during the First World War. This strategy was all about injecting some enthusiasm and energy into the troops to catch the enemy off guard and break through the front lines by ramping up the speed and intensity of attacks. Crâne meant courage, discipline, and determination in battle. It was developed as a way to build on the concept of élan because enthusiasm and energy weren't enough on their own. Soldiers also needed to show endurance and determination in the face of adversity. In 1914, August was the most terrible month in world history. The Germans won almost all the battles against France, and the French armies had to retreat towards Paris. This retreat, known as the Grand Retreat, seemed to bring France to the brink of defeat. In fact, on September 2nd, the French government abandoned Paris, fearing an invasion. But General Joffre was waiting for the right moment to attack. The French saw that the German army wasn't working together, so they decided to counterattack on September 6th. The French convinced British Expeditionary Force commander Sir John French to join the operation, and they launched the First Battle of the Marne by attacking the gaps between the German armies. This battle didn't result in a total victory or defeat for either side, but it saved the French from a humiliating defeat and put a stop to the German plan to take France out of the war in 40 days. It wasn't just 40 days either. The armies of both sides would have to fight in this region for 1,400 days. The French, defending their country against the confident Germans, managed to stop them in their tracks. But this success led to the creation of the Western Front, which was a total inferno. For 4 years, millions of people would have to fight in the trenches in this region with the new technology that had emerged, toys. Over the next 4 years, both sides would try to gain the upper hand by attacking again and again in search of an absolute victory. Marrache, Verdun, the Somme, and many other unfortunate events. These battles, which claimed thousands of lives, were the deadliest in 1917. However, in 1917, there was a promising development for the Entente. After intercepting a telegram, the United States decided to enter the war. This was great news for the soldiers who had been fighting in the trenches for years. It meant that the war, which had been going on for too long, might finally be over. America's entry into the war would change the balance of power and have a huge impact on the war and on many people's lives. One of these people was Henry Nicholas Gunther. Henry was born in 1895 in Baltimore, USA. His family, like many Americans, was of European descent with roots in Germany. Henry was born in one of the German neighborhoods of eastern Baltimore. After getting his education, he started working as an accountant at the Baltimore National Bank. While Henry, who was newly engaged, kept up with his work at the bank, the war was in full swing. There was a lot of debate in the U.S. about whether to join the war. Given the circumstances, the United States entered the war on the side of the Entente in 1917. Henry's life took a turn with this decision. With America's entry into the war, the Western Front began to see new casualties. The United States, which had a very small regular army before entering the war, would benefit from its distance from continental Europe after entering the war. In 1917, the National Army Enrollment Act brought the American Army up to 4 million soldiers, a number that would have a big impact on the war's outcome. Gunther signed up in September 1917. Like a lot of Baltimoreans, Henry was assigned to the 313th Infantry Regiment, where he served as a supply sergeant. He was in charge of making sure the soldiers had the right equipment and clothing. Once he'd completed the requisite training, he arrived in France in July 1918 as part of the American Expeditionary Force. France was in a pretty bad state when Gunther got there. It wasn't even necessary to go into the trenches to feel the war. The scars of battle were everywhere. The country was in a state of disrepair. Despite the millions of men who had enlisted, the American army was in a pretty bad spot. The vast majority of them were civilians with no combat experience, and the war had taken a psychological toll on them. Henry was one of the young soldiers who was pretty horrified by what he saw. Everything changed for Sergeant Gunther when he wrote a letter to a friend describing the horrors of the trenches and suggesting he avoid frontline service if possible. The letter was picked up by the Army Mail Censorship Unit and sent on to Gunther's commanding officer. When the U.S. declared war on Germany in April 1917, it was cautious about its German-born population. The authorities were looking out for any signs of disloyalty among those of German descent. On top of that, 2 months after the war started, the Espionage Act was passed. This made it a crime to leak information that could slow down the war or support America's enemies. Soldiers were also told what they could and couldn't write in their letters to their families. Even President Woodrow Wilson was worried about people of German descent being disloyal. In a speech to Congress, he said, "With millions of German-born men and women living among us, the war will require a new definition of national loyalty. It will be dealt with by the hand of severe repression." Given the climate at the time, Gunther was on the brink of doing something that would have serious consequences for him. After the incident, Sergeant Henry Gunther was now going by Private Gunther. He was taken off supply duty and sent to the front line as an infantryman. This coincided with the 313th Regiment's 2-month period of intense fighting. On top of all that, he left his fiancée during those days. The war was coming to an end. The Allies made a big change in tactics towards the end of the war. For years, the two sides had been planning massive offensives, and they'd worn each other out. Millions of people on both sides had been lost in this brutal conflict on the Western Front. Instead of focusing their efforts on one area, the Allies planned several offensives across the front to wear down the Germans. In contrast to previous years, there was no intention of pushing any particular line to its limits. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was launched in partnership with the Americans, was set to be one of the bloodiest battles of the war. For 47 days, the battles were intense, and the armies suffered significant casualties. And there were other challenges too, beyond the bullets and bombs. Spanish influenza was also a major problem, disabling many soldiers and killing many more in the final period of the war. By the beginning of October, the Hindenburg Line, the German line of defense, had started to be breached. The defeats at Saint-Quentin, Cambrai, and the Argonne, in particular, spelled the end of Germany's involvement in the war. After a month and a half of intense fighting, Private Gunther survived the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. On November 8th, the Allies met with the Germans. The last few loose ends were tied up to put an end to this 4-year bloodbath. After 3 days of talks, the two sides came to an agreement, and the armistice agreement that ended World War I was signed. One interesting aspect of the armistice agreement was that it was signed on November 11th, the 11th day of the 11th month. Since there wasn't enough technology at the time to end the war instantly, a period of time was needed to end the ongoing clashes announced a ceasefire to all troops, and silenced the guns. The agreement was signed at around 5 a.m., setting a clear date to ensure that this momentous event would not be forgotten. 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At 11 o'clock, all the guns would fall silent, and the world would be at peace once again. With this decision, Gunther would reach his own conclusion. Gunther was going through a rough patch. He'd been demoted and was struggling mentally. He was always thinking about it and really focused on proving himself to his fellow soldiers. The label of German sympathizer was especially damaging. After he was successful at the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, which was part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he became a company messenger. This was a pretty risky gig. A messenger had to deliver the news, even if his route crossed the most open terrain. Gunther was still in this role on November 11th, the last day of the war. Brigadier General William Nicholson, the brigade commander, told his troops there would be no halts until 11 o'clock sharp. Gunther's company was given the order to advance on the nearby town of Ville-devant-Chaumont. The war was almost over. Gunther was in the neighborhoods just outside the town with his fellow reporters. They already knew that the fighting would end at 11 o'clock. As the troops advanced on the town, they spotted a machine gun nest in the distance. The other soldiers thought it would be best to wait until 11 o'clock. But for Gunther, who was struggling with some psychological issues, this was his last chance. He would wipe the slate clean, prove his patriotism to those who had turned their backs on him, and return to his country as a hero, not a stigma. When the Germans in the position saw Gunther coming towards them, they gave him a wave. They told him in broken English that the war was over and to go back. But Gunther ignored the warnings and kept moving forward. Gunther pulled out his gun and fired a few shots from his rifle. After trying several times to turn him back without success, the Germans turned their machine guns on Gunther. They started by firing a few bullets in his direction, but they had no choice but to keep firing at this crazy soldier who just kept coming at them. The Germans knocked Gunther down with a few bullets after pointing the machine gun at him. Gunther was the last of the nearly 10 million soldiers to die in World War I, following Albert Mayer, the first soldier to die. He hit the ground at 10:59. A minute later, all the guns fell silent. The German machine gun crew came out with a stretcher and placed Gunther on it. They took him on the stretcher to his friends in his unit. The Germans explained that they were trying to intercept Gunther and had to shoot him in self-defense. Maybe Henry Gunther wanted to follow his commander Nicholson's orders and keep going. Maybe his experiences during the Meuse-Argonne offensive drove him to such a state of mind. Perhaps he ran to his death in a mental breakdown brought on by his experiences. We'll never know for sure. After he passed away, the U.S. Army gave Gunther the Distinguished Service Cross and honored him. This was one of the many sad stories from World War I that ended up on the back burner.